Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the OFN Meeting Room on the Our Lads Football Radio Network. Before we get started talking Baltimore Ravens football, we are going to remind you to order your subscription of the Our Lads Draft Guide. So 39 years and counting, the Our Lads Draft Guide. Log on to ourlads.com and you can see the draft guide right here. #1 guide. Yes, that's it. Kick ass around the country. And this is a great time to order the guide. As I welcome in my special guest talking Baltimore Ravens football. And Matthew Stevens has been on this program several times. He's the managing editor for the Ravens Wire at usatoday.com. Unless something's changed, Matthew, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, getting excited for this draft.
Yeah, because I actually did this with I always ask, or I usually ask my guests if I haven't had them on for like several months, hey, are you still with, who you were with before? And I just I was going to say it to one of my guests. It was who was it that this happened to? Anyway, it was Bill Hewer. And he was with I think he was with the Packer Report, maybe. And Sports Illustrated has been really gobbling up these magazine guys, and so he moved to SI, and I was still calling him from his previous job, and he didn't. He reminded me after. He could have reminded me on the air. I mean, I don't mind when people correct me when I'm wrong on the air but whatever. He had the SI banner behind him, though, so at least he had that going on. But you don't have anything like that. You got to get some sort of I don't know, something in the background. Do you do a lot of videos, Matthew?
I don't. I've got a face for radio for sure.
Well, come on now. This isn't the radio anymore, though.
You're not wrong. You're definitely not wrong, and I certainly do enough of these types of things. You're probably right. I should have something behind me with Ravens Wire all over it for sure.
Sure, absolutely. I think they'll like you for it. All right. Anyway, let's talk Ravens football, and not a lot of cap space. That's hurt them. That's crippled them the last couple of years. But they did make a big trade in bringing in Calais Campbell. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. They tagged Matthew Judon. But I think most importantly is the draft capital that the team has. And correct me if I'm wrong, that besides the 28th pick in the first round, they have 7 picks in the top 134.
Yeah, they've got 7 picks in the first 4 rounds. And even if you want to, double down on that, they've got 5 in the first 106. So Baltimore's certainly stacked at the top of this draft for sure.
Yeah, and that's what you want to have going for you when you don't have the money to spend. So it just shows you that they do things right. I forget who it was that I was talking to a few days ago where the team didn't have any money and they didn't have a lot of draft picks either. So that's not the way to go. But that's the difference. The Ravens, I'm trying to remember who the team was. Whoever it was wasn't a playoff team. So you know that the Ravens usually do things right. And they are doing things right. How are they going to correct that problem eventually? Is there something? Do they have a plan within the next year or two so that they're not in cap hell anymore?
Yeah, I mean, even looking at next season, once they kind of get rid of some of their dead money and maybe some of their more bloated contracts become a little bit more manageable or guys that can get cut, Baltimore actually has a ton of cap space next year. I mean, even just going by the current cap that's set up for this year, they're expected to have over $90 million next year. So Baltimore is actually really, really looking good over the next 2 or 3 years. Obviously they still have to pay guys like Ronnie Stanley and Marlon Humphrey and eventually Lamar Jackson. But for where Baltimore has been over the last really decade, looking really, really good next year.
Well, considering you've got the draft capital this year, cap space the next year, and you would think the team would maybe be able to take the next step after making the playoffs another year with Lamar Jackson. So things look like they're going pretty well for the Baltimore Ravens. And let's talk about what I think might be their top need. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the top need could very well be that right guard spot vacated by Marshall Yonda. Now, maybe it's a luxury. I get it. But I remember when I mean, you get a player that, and I know guards usually aren't, especially if you got a top 10 pick, that's not normally, I mean, how rare? I think it was the Colts who picked, what's his name? The guard that they picked up a couple years ago, the really good guard.
Quentin Nelson.
Yes, and that's a rare thing. Or David DeCastro from the Steelers a few years ago. Very rare to get a guard that you feel that confident with early in the draft. But the Ravens are picking later, so that's nothing to worry about. But do you think that with Yonda gone, that right guard is going to be a very important position for them in the draft?
Oh, for sure. I mean, you're looking at a team that just got done breaking a 41-year-old rushing record, most rushing yards in a single season by an NFL team. So Baltimore clearly values their offensive line. They want guys that can go out there, compete. They want the depth, more importantly, and that's really been kind of Baltimore's strength on the offensive line for the last handful of years. But, replacing a probable Hall of Famer in Marshall Yonda, that's a tough ask for anyone to do. But if you're going to do it, chances are you're probably going to be looking for a guy in the first 3 rounds, unless you have confidence in a guy already on the roster. And Baltimore did draft someone there last year, Ben Powers, in the fourth
Yep.
round. So, they might feel confident with that. But as we saw last offseason at left guard and at center, Baltimore likes having 3 or 4 guys compete for that job, no matter where their draft is, or where their draft stock was. Orlando Brown had to fight for the job at right tackle, despite being a third-round pick. Many thought he was a first-round pick that year. So yeah, Baltimore's going to have guys compete for that job regardless of who's there.
Chances are that if they do go with one of those players, that maybe they take a Ruiz or a Hennessy, somebody that is really more a center that could maybe eventually take over for center, but you start him off at guard.
Yeah, and Baltimore loves that versatility, and you can even kind of think about that from a tackle, maybe trying to push a tackle inside as well. Baltimore doesn't have a whole lot of depth at tackle either, so a guy that can play on the outside probably is better inside. Certainly that's a guy that they could be looking at there as well. I know Jonah Jackson is a guy that has been frequently mocked to Baltimore in that exact circumstance. But yeah, center, outside, I think if a guy can play more than one position on this offensive line, Baltimore is going to key on him specifically.
And the kid Macari actually played pretty well, didn't he? When there was some injuries, he stepped in and did a pretty good job for an undrafted rookie.
Yeah, actually, he actually played better. If you go by Pro Football Focus's ratings, he actually played better than Matt Skura, the guy that he replaced. And for that matter, I mean, both of them are undrafted free agents. So maybe that speaks to Baltimore's ability to find guys later in the draft or after the draft, develop them for a year or two, and turn them into, guys who close to Pro Bowl starters.
Let's talk about the other top need, in my opinion, and that is after losing C.J. Mosley a couple years ago, you just weren't able to replace him last year. It didn't work out. So nothing has happened on the roster so far where I see that they've still replaced C.J. Mosley. So middle linebacker, inside linebacker, that has got to be one of their top needs.
Yeah, Baltimore thought they kind of had maybe their answer last year. They had Patrick Onwuasu. Ultimately, ended up not only losing his communication helmet partway through the season, ended up losing his job to, a guy that Baltimore signed before Week 5 that was on his couch. So that really does kind of, if you're looking at this team, that really does point at how little depth Baltimore has heading into this offseason and into the season. So certainly it is one of their probably more pressing needs. Now, the big question, I think, for any team, and the Ravens especially, are how much do you value inside linebacker in a way that maybe you didn't 10 years ago? Sure. You're using a lot more dime. You're using a lot more nickel coverage. You're sliding safeties down. Do you need a 3-down linebacker? If so, you're probably looking in the first 2 rounds for one. If you want a guy that maybe can stuff the run and you can switch up your secondary a little bit in order to fill that on obvious passing downs, then maybe you look for a guy that's in the 4th, 5th round and can do just one thing really, really well.
The defensive line, a lot of movement. Calais Campbell is here for at least a year, and to get a player of that caliber for a fifth-round draft pick is pretty darn good. I'm sure the fans are stoked about that. Derek Wolfe comes in from Denver. So those are the two big additions up front. But Campbell's older, and Wolfe is an okay player. You got to believe that the Ravens are still going to probably look for a couple of more linemen as far as depth, though, in this draft, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, half of their defensive linemen right now are only signed through next year or the year after. And as you kind of mentioned or alluded to, not all those guys might even make it to that second season before they're either cut or it's just whatever else ends up happening. So finding more depth there is important. And again, Baltimore has that flexibility by having a Calais Campbell, by having a Derek Wolfe up front, to be able to maybe take a guy in the middle rounds, later rounds. They don't necessarily have to reach for a guy, but certainly that's going to be on their draft list for sure, because they have to plan for the next 2-3 years.
How will they miss Michael Pierce as far as the way that he played in the Ravens scheme? They also had the trade to Pittsburgh. I mean, how often do the Ravens trade with the Steelers for Wormley? But you got Wormley gone, Pierce gone. Pierce, on paper, a little bit more of an important player. So how do they replace him as far as in their scheme?
Well, I think, one, Pierce came into training camp last year overweight, out of shape, earned kind of the ire of Coach Harbaugh, who actually kicked him out of practice at one point, eventually brought him back. So, while I think that probably has some weight on what their decision this offseason to maybe let Pierce go, I think they kind of upgrade it by getting a guy like Wolfe, getting a guy like Calais Campbell, and then re-signing guys like Jihad Ward and Justin Ellis to kind of like I had mentioned with inside linebacker. You hope that those guys can maybe do individual things better than what Michael Pierce could do as a whole package.
Okay.
You hope that Derek Wolfe can maybe present a better pass rush option than what Michael Pierce could, and is hopefully better, or at least just as stout in the run. But then you've got your big boys like Justin Ellis and Dalen Mack, who are just going to eat up space as guys that are 300 plus pounds, and you stick them in there and you hope they can play that kind of old Sam Adams role in Baltimore, where it's going to take two guys to get him a yard off the ball.
Yeah, those are valuable, no question about it, especially in the 3-4 that the Ravens like to run. Talk about the linebacking situation here with Judon being tagged. What's that? That's just strategic. It's not like, I mean, Judon's a good player, but the best players don't necessarily get tagged anymore. You used to always think, oh, franchise player, that must mean he's the franchise player, but it's strategic for really good players based on where they're slotted, how much money contractually the Ravens are going to be able to figure, especially like you said, the money is going to open up. So I'm sure they're going to be able to work out on some sort of a deal next year when they have more money. But Judon, separate him from getting tagged and to him being a really valuable player to this defense. How? Give me the difference there between the two.
Well, I think, as you mentioned, this is more strategic from a money standpoint. Judon was up for a contract, and in this market, as you're seeing with Clowney, no one really knows what to pay an outside linebacker right now. Certainly at the upper end of this market, and where maybe Judon wants a long-term contract that was a little bit more than what Baltimore is willing to pay. Baltimore certainly had the option to go, hey, look, we're going to pay you, a little under $16 million this year, and we'll see what happens in the market. Once the market's been set, then we'll give you a long-term contract, but we're just not going to give you money for the sake of giving you money and hoping that turns out to be a good deal. Baltimore had the cap space to kind of sit and wait realistically, and I think once you see a guy like Clowney get signed, that will really set the market for Judon and for Baltimore. And maybe Judon and his agent decide, you know what, we'll play through this 1 year. We'll hit it again next year, and maybe the market will expand at that point. Or maybe it's just a matter of after the draft, they'll be able to get something done. Clowney will get signed, and they'll have their market there. But Judon is a super important part of this team. I mean, I think when guys look at outside linebackers and pass rushers especially, they look only at the sack total. And while Judon had a good number of them, 9.5 last year, he had a bunch of quarterback hits, he had a bunch of quarterback pressures. He's like Terrell Suggs in the way that he's also a great edge defender. He's the guy that can set the edge over there. He's a guy that can play in the flats. They even moved him around to inside linebacker at times in certain packages last year. So he's a guy that just brings a lot of versatility and does a lot of things and can be that 3-down outside linebacker that you really need in a 3-4 defense. So again, I think when you look at his stats, maybe they don't tell the whole story of what Judon does, and maybe his value looks a little bit less in that regard. But Baltimore certainly wants to keep a guy like that on this team long term. Again, just like they did with Terrell Suggs all those years ago.
Yeah, there's no question the Ravens have done a great job for many years. Ozzie Newsome leading the way as far as evaluating talent. And they have tried a lot over the years. Maybe, like you said, because Suggs was eventually getting older, and Lewis obviously was gone and Scott was gone, but Suggs was the perfect example of another edge rusher. And when you're running the type of defense the Ravens run, the more edge rushing talent you can get, the better your defense is going to be. But Judon seems to be the only guy standing over the last 5 years or so. I mean, they have tried so many guys at that spot. And I guess the one guy that's still standing on the team draft-wise would be Bowser as a second-round pick. But everybody else is gone. So why is that just the way it is? Just, one of those stretches? That's because maybe Jalen Ferguson's the next guy.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you there. It's been a little head scratching seeing these guys kind of come and go after Baltimore's done so well with drafting and developing talent. I mean, Judon was a 5th-round pick, so
Yeah.
Baltimore certainly knows how to get it right when they do. But Tim Williams gone, Kamale Correa gone. Those types of guys they were hoping were going to be their answer, even beyond Judon. All those guys are no longer on this team, and I think that goes back to when you look at DaCosta taking over for Ozzie Newsome. He seems to have a lot less patience with those guys not developing into better players, not developing even into a role. And you look at Tim Williams last year, barely made the 53-man roster. And then a few week games into the season, just they weren't getting anything out of him. They weren't getting the production they should have gotten. So, they tried to trade him, decided, you know what, we can't get anything for you. We're just going to let you go, man. You're just not worth it anymore. They also did it with, some wide receivers last year as well in training camp. Cut a guy relatively early after taking him, just 2 years prior. So Baltimore, it seems, has kind of transitioned under new general manager Derek DaCosta to have a very, no BS attitude. If you're not getting better, we will find someone else to do your job.
And is that something that maybe DaCosta learned might have been a weakness of Ozzie's as he was getting on? Or how else can you explain why under the tutelage of Ozzie would he be a little bit different in that respect?
I think you look at guys like Kamale Correa and a bunch of guys that Baltimore's had over the years, they've tend to hold on to those, early mid-round guys maybe a little longer than they should have, in spite of them not doing well, not developing. And I imagine after 2-3 years, you know what a player is going to be. He's not going to suddenly, in that 5th year, become an all-pro, all of a sudden. So I think that's kind of it. Is just, look, man, if you're not doing it, you're not doing it, and we could use the roster space to find someone that could.
Okay, the secondary, and Baltimore acquired Peters last year, so he's there. You got Humphrey in the slot. But Carr's gone. So is that right now? And Young's always hurt. So does that mean that cornerback is definitely a priority, and you could see maybe one taken as early as the 1st round?
I think with Baltimore, you can never really throw out anything. I mean, honestly, they picked Marlon Humphrey, not that long ago, in spite of being pretty stacked at cornerback. They took him in the 1st round. He turned into an all-pro this year. So again, it's hard to hate on that strategy. But I don't think so. I don't think that is necessarily a need that they absolutely have. I see that being, again, kind of more toward the end of this draft, where they'll target a guy who can play more inside. Because they did re-sign Jimmy Smith again on a 1-year contract. So they've got three outside guys in Humphreys, in Peters, and in Jimmy Smith. They've also got some young guys, Anthony Averett and Iman Marshall, that they think can play on the outside as well.
Okay.
Really, I think the big caveat, and you mentioned it, is Tavon Young inside. How are they going to plan for, his injuries? His injury history certainly is a little shaky, and I think that's going to be their big question this offseason on maybe who they slide in there throughout training camp, in case Tavon Young isn't able to go at any point, or if he hasn't fully healed from that neck injury from last year.
And before we switch over to offense, do they need maybe another strong safety, somebody, because you've got some good cover safeties, elite cover safeties, really, but maybe and Chuck Clark seemed to do a pretty decent job. He was re-signed, but maybe just another guy to compete.
Yeah, I think just like we mentioned with slot corner, with nickel corner, Baltimore has some depth at safety, but those guys are injured a little bit. And they got rid of Tony Jefferson this offseason, let him go find another team, hopefully another big contract there. But Deshaun Elliott is a guy that I know they have a lot of belief in, but has missed the last two seasons due to injuries. So you start kind of wondering, all right, well, can we count on that guy? And then for that matter, Earl Thomas, despite playing really well last season, is a guy that in the next year or two could potentially be a cap casualty for Baltimore if they want to go ahead and save that money. So while I think a lot of pundits aren't gearing up for safety in the early rounds, Baltimore should certainly look at that position as a position you could take an elite guy in the first 2 or 3 rounds. You sit him behind Earl Thomas, you sit him behind Chuck Clark, you let him go ahead and learn under really smart guys, and then you transition to your young guy in another year or two who's ready for the limelight.
On offense, it's a great receiver class. Everybody's known this for months. So finally, we're going to get to see where all these talented players go. Brown was the big pickup last year in the first round. He also picked up Boykin in the third round. So it looks like you got a couple of good young receivers to work on there. Roberts is gone. He played a lot last year. Snead's a free agent, but I don't think they're going to have to worry about him if they want to re-sign him. But he does play the slot. So, but in general, the depth just doesn't look very, very convincing. So with all the draft picks they have, and with the need for more depth at receiver, maybe a couple of receivers in this draft?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I would be shocked if they didn't take one. But I wouldn't be shocked if they took 3 either at the same time. And, as you mentioned, you got Marquise Brown, who played phenomenally despite being injured all season long. You've got Miles Boykin, who showed a lot of flashes and is a big guy. I think he's going to take over kind of that Seth Roberts, just a great downfield blocker type of a role, possession guy that you can use on the outside. And then you've got a guy like Willie Snead who can play in the slot. So you've got a decent starting lineup. I don't think it's a bunch of all pros by any stretch of the imagination. But as you mentioned, depth is a huge concern. And even for then, you're hoping Miles Boykin turns out. You're hoping Marquise Brown is able to expand upon his rookie season. You're hoping Willie Snead continues to do well and you're able to re-sign him after the end of the season. Or maybe some of those young guys, Jaleel Scott, as I had mentioned earlier, Antoine Wesley is another guy, even Chris Moore, who they brought back this year. You're hoping those guys pan out, but Baltimore has not had a lot of success in that regard. And the reason why the roster looks like it does is because Baltimore has not had a lot of success in drafting and developing their own guys. So, taking a bunch of shots at a historically deep draft class makes a ton of sense for Baltimore in this specific draft.
Could they? And I guess maybe I'll answer my own question based on how you answered it with Humphrey, and they'll take a player no matter how deep they are at that position. So could they use or spend their first round draft pick on a receiver?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Marquise Brown showed a lot last year, but you could use that. If a guy falls down, a Ruggs or a Judy, falls down, Baltimore, they have the ammunition to trade up and go get a guy like that.
Yeah.
If a guy falls down at number 20, I think that would be an ideal situation for Baltimore if they love a guy like that. Go up and go get him, man. Get the guy that's going to play next to Marquise Brown for the next 5 years, and help your MVP quarterback in a way that you didn't really do with Joe Flacco. Uh, give your guy a bunch of really good starting wide receivers, and see what happens after building on an MVP season.
Yeah, because when you are that successful and that dangerous running the football, just imagine how explosive the offense can be if you've got weapons running around in the in the in coverage where everybody's concerned about the running game, and especially if you got speed out there. Wow, you're talking about a lot more danger that they already have and already pose to opposing defenses. Um, I do have to ask you about one of those players that didn't pan out, since I'm a Jet fan, and that's Perryman. Because I'll be honest with you. I mean, look, I wasn't really sure that I wanted anything to do with Perryman when he was available as a free agent, just because I didn't really follow too much of what he's done the last couple of years, because what he's done the last couple of years were late in the season, kind of when you're not paying too much attention, unless you have him on your fantasy team or something like that. So he kind of snuck under the radar, and I just kept remembering the Baltimore days and the disappointment and the drops and the injuries. But when you look at it, you say, well, sometimes it takes players change of scenery, a little bit longer to develop. So do you have faith that Brashard Perryman can actually develop into a really good receiver that will finally warrant where he was drafted?
I do. I mean, as much as I've maybe kind of ragged on Perryman over the years,
Deserved it.
yeah, honestly, he did. I think in Baltimore deserved the flack they got for taking him in the first round. But at the same time, and we've seen this happen to so many teams over the years, you can't teach size and you can't teach speed. 6'2", 215 pounds, blazing fast, but just didn't have all the other things together in order to be a true number one wide receiver. So he was really a developmental prospect in my eyes from day one. Baltimore tried the best they possibly could, but as I mentioned, they have not exactly been great at drafting and developing guys in house over the last 24 years. So seeing a guy like that who, again, had all the physical traits you want from a guy, from a number one wide receiver, but just maybe not the intangibles, maybe not the route running or the focus and things like that. You can teach those things, but Baltimore certainly has not had success there. So probably just a bad fit all around. But went to Tampa last year, certainly did well, caught 36 passes, 645 yards, 6 touchdowns. I mean, it's hard to hate on that.
And that happened in like 6 games.
Exactly. And Perriman throughout his entire career is a guy who will suddenly just explode, catch 2 or 3 big passes, and you go, man, all right, finally he's figured it out. And the next game he drops 3 passes and goes on injured reserve.
Yeah.
I hope that he's able to turn it around. I think he can. The key is he's got to go to teams that have good quarterback play, that's willing to put him in the lineup, and has a good coaching staff to be able to get him into that next level. I don't know if the Jets have that ultimately, but I think he's hopefully he's in a good spot to kind of live out that first round pick status that he should have had.
Well, if he can do it in New York, it'll double his notoriety, and he'll definitely get his payday. And of course, I'm rooting for that. Before we move away from receiver, I want to include tight end, because the Hurst trade opened up a spot, because the Ravens really used 3 tight ends in their offense, so one's missing. So I would guess that that's definitely a priority.
I don't necessarily know if it's a priority. I mean, Baltimore does love their tight ends. They have 2 starting tight ends already. They've got Mark Andrews, who had a great season. They've got Nick Boyle, who is probably one of the best blocking tight ends in the league, and is kind of an underrated pass catcher as well. We saw a little bit of that last season. So I think Baltimore feels pretty good with where they're at there, but they do like that third guy to be able to interchange in and out with both Boyle and with Andrews. I think this is a draft in which it's not great for tight ends, but maybe you can find a guy in those late rounds who is either a really good receiver but can't block, or is a great blocker and is not a receiver, and you kind of you supplement what you already have, and a guy that maybe doesn't necessarily have to be a high snap guy like Hurst ultimately had to be as a first round pick.
Were you surprised about the trade?
Yes and no. It's Baltimore tends to not give up on first round guys. I mean, obviously, Brashad Perryman played out most of his 4 years here in Baltimore, in spite of all the issues. So I was a little shocked that they got rid of Hurst in that regard. But there had been rumblings that just ultimately he wasn't happy here. He was really trying to get out and trying to get into a spot where he could excel. The fact that trade value Atlanta gave up for him makes it an easier pill to swallow.
Yeah.
But so to answer your question, yeah, I mean, yes, said no. It was a little shocking, but second round pick, it's again hard to hate on that.
Absolutely, because you go maybe another year, and now you're talking fifth and sixth round draft pick. It drops that, because when they're young, you have to get split second to make that decision to take advantage of that talent and that slotting. And I guess, look, I don't blame Hurst. He wants to be the Mark Andrews of a team. He wants the one that gets 100 targets during the season, and I'm sure he's going to get it in Atlanta. So maybe a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely,
for both teams.
Absolutely.
Last one.
And
go ahead.
As you mentioned, with youth, Hurst came into the league a little bit older than most of his counterparts, strictly because he had a baseball career before this. So if you're Baltimore, that time bomb was ticking even harder for Baltimore than I think with any other of their draft picks.
And lastly, the running back position, with a rushing attack as dangerous as Baltimore, you would think, well, they don't need anything at running back. But Ingram had his injury issues, and I like Gus Edwards being a Rutgers guy, so I knew what Gus Edwards was about. We talked about it before, I think, that first season, about what maybe he could be in the future, and he certainly lived up to that. Justice Hill is a nice player, but I don't think what we saw statistically from him was anything impressive. Could you see the Ravens using one of their early mid-round picks on a running back?
I could, and mainly the reason for that is just like we mentioned with safety. Baltimore has guys that they can start right now. I think they feel pretty comfortable where they're at right this minute. But you look to next season. Gus Edwards is on a exclusive rights free agent deal, and ultimately, even though he's going to be a UFA next year, or a restricted free agent next year, you can get him back for relatively cheap. Does he play up to that this year to warrant it? And, certainly Ingram went down in the playoff game. They didn't give Gus Edwards a ton of carries in spite of Ingram being down. So maybe that points to them not feeling as great about Edwards as I think maybe a lot of other people do. I'm not entirely sure, but next offseason, Mark Ingram, you cut him, it's $5 million back against the cap. So that's certainly there, and he'll be 32 years old at that point. And then Justice Hill, I saw a lot of flashes out of him last year. I think he's a guy that maybe can fit into that Ray Rice type of a role from a handful of years ago, but certainly he's not a proven commodity. If you're Baltimore and you love running the football as much as you do, it would be silly to turn down a guy that has a top 2 running back in this draft if you can get him at a great steal.
Okay, so Matthew, I know it's late in the draft, which means you have probably 10 guys and 4 or 5 positions that you could guess where Baltimore is going to go. So let's say they stick right where they are in the first round. Give me your best guess, position or two, and a player or two.
All right, in the first round, I'm thinking, as we mentioned, edge rusher and inside linebacker are kind of their 2 biggest needs right now. I'm looking at a guy like Zach Bond as a guy who maybe can do a little bit of both in Baltimore's scheme, a guy who's very versatile, who you can throw around really all over the front 7. It would not shock me if they went that route. Certainly if a guy falls, a wide receiver or a safety or Cesar Ruiz is available there, those are options as well for Baltimore, depending on where they have them on their board. I think at number 28, they're going to let a guy drop to them and take whoever's the best available player in spite of any major needs.
All right, sounds good, Matthew. So Twitter, it's at Matthew S_NFL, correct?
Absolutely.
Great. And we look forward to talking to you again after the draft and a lot of picks. So you'll probably be one of my first calls because there'll be a ton of players, and I'm sure there'll be a few deals here and there. And maybe they'll excite the fan base by trading up. Who knows? But I think we'll have an exciting conversation after the draft.
Absolutely. Baltimore does love wheeling and dealing, so those 9 picks could become 11 or 12 real fast.
Thanks, Matthew. We'll talk to you after the draft.
Absolutely. Thanks for having
You
me.
got it.